There's something majestic about abandoned tanks and military equipment, once feared instruments of death, reduced to rusting pieces of nature, abandoned to whoever might walk past it.
Abandoned armored vehicles have this eerie sense about them. How did this once incredibly expensive war machine end up just an abandoned pile of scrap metal? Sometimes under fire, other times systematically mothballed in fields, serving as their cemeteries. But each one tells a unique story.
If you were to wander across the windswept grasslands of Shimshu Island in Russia's far east, you might stumble upon something that looks like it was frozen in time. This is the Japanese Type 97 Chi-Hai tank, sitting exactly where it was knocked out on August of 1945. The cannon still points toward the shore, aimed at the very spot where Soviet landing craft came charging in during one of the last battles of World War II.
The battle was part of a little-known amphibious invasion by the Soviets in the Kuril Islands, just 2 weeks before the Japanese surrendered in World War II. The Kurils are a chain of volcanic islands that have been a strategic prize for centuries because of their ability to control the approach to Russia from the Pacific. In August of 1945, the Soviets wanted the Kuril Islands badly. One, because it would secure their position in the Pacific post-World War II, and because it would fulfill their obligation to the rest of the Allies to join in the war against Japan.
All around its rusty brown hull, the peaceful green hills rolling gently down toward the gray sea. You wouldn't know this quiet place was once the scene of a brutal close-quarters armored fight.
What followed was a short but brutal battle, with 8,000 men fighting on both sides, and casualties quickly mounting into the thousands. On the first day of fighting, this very Type 97 tank was put out of action. When archaeologists returned to the site decades later, in the summer of 2013, they found it exactly where it fell. Inside, they discovered artifacts from the war, including the remains of one of its crewmen, Sergeant Taichi Ito.
Taking a closer look at the vehicle today, you can see the scars of the battle in its rusted hull, holes punched straight through the steel by heavy rounds. The investigation actually revealed that it had been disabled by a 14.5mm anti-tank rifle, most likely the Soviet PTRD or PTRS. Evidence of the tracks stuck in the creek suggests the tank likely got stuck there and was unable to free itself. This made it a helpless sitting duck for Soviet troops. In fact, a fragment from one of those large caliber rounds was found lodged inside. At close range, about 100 meters, the 14.5mm small arms round could pierce 1.5 inches of armor, which was bad news for your Type 97. So why is this tank still sitting here nearly 80 years later? There are a few reasons. Sometimes wrecks like this are deliberately left as monuments to victory, reminders of the soldiers who fought and died there. Other times the terrain is so remote and the wrecks so heavy that removing them simply would cost too much. It almost makes me think, could someone with the right tools get the thing fired up if they just had the time and know-how? And so it remains a relic of steel and war, sitting quietly under the open sky, watching the same stretch of shoreline it once fought to defend.
This is the world's largest aircraft cemetery. It's home to over 4,000 discarded planes across 2,600 acres of land. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base is located right outside of Tucson, Arizona in the United States. But most people know it by its nickname, the Boneyard. It began as a civilian airport, established in 1925 as Davis-Monthan Landing Field. It was later repurposed during World War II for bomber crew training and even housed German POWs before its long-term shift to aircraft storage. Its purpose as storage has been around since at least 1945, to house all the B-29 bombers after World War II.
In addition to storage and restoration, AMARG also acts like a giant organ donor program for aircraft. Parts are carefully removed, tagged, and shipped all over the world to keep other planes flying. Even the old rubber tires from these planes get reused. Nothing sits here entirely forgotten. That means every airframe is on the books, cataloged down to the rivets with some kind of SN number. I wouldn't want to lose a sensitive item there.
It reached its peak plane population in 1973, with 6,080 different aircraft all stored at that one place. After that, it grew in size. By the 1990s, they were in charge of destroying 365 B-52 bombers after the Cold War. That's 4 times as many that are actively in service today. Now the boneyard is home to everything from fighter jets to bombers, helicopters, and even space shuttles. All sitting there in just a neat line, a real testament to American industry and air power. It would be a museum today if it wasn't still under consideration for picking through for parts. These bones could very well one day be scrapped back into service. It's stored here because of the desert's low humidity, low rainfall, and alkaline soil that all act like a giant freezer, keeping the parts as fresh as possible, to one day possibly be used again. If that sounds a little far-fetched, it's not. The 500 workers at the facility have already restored a B-52 bomber into active duty after more than a decade in storage. And don't worry, there are still a remaining 12 B-52 carcasses still there. Right now, their focus has been on taking old decommissioned F-16s, strapping them with an AI pilot, and then using that new robot plane for target practice for the modern jets that we have. From the tour bus, the symmetry is almost hypnotic as you pass through the rows. Mile after mile of perfectly aligned aircraft, all pointing the same way, like they're still waiting for the order to take off. It's all oddly beautiful, in a Mad Max sort of way at least. From the ground, it looks like a frozen air show, stretching out to the horizon.
Flamingo Beach is right off the coast of Puerto Rico. It's beautiful crystal clear water and tropical looking island that stands in stark contrast to the rusting metal old M4 Sherman tank hulls that litter the shore. And what are they doing there? In 1901, after Spain handed Puerto Rico over to the United States, President Roosevelt decided the tiny speck of an island, Culebra, would be perfect for the US Navy. He gave them all the public land, and the military quickly turned the place into a proving ground. First, it was used to practice landings and maneuvers for amphibious assaults, and by 1936, it was used for some live bombing runs. The Navy placed decommissioned tanks along the shoreline to serve as bombing and gunnery targets. In 1969 alone, Navy pilots pounded Culebra with missiles for 228 separate days as they trained for the war in Vietnam.
But there was a major issue. Culebra was not uninhabited. I should know, I got food poisoning there once when I was 14. That's a true story, by the way. The street food vendor. People lived all across the island, and believe it or not, they weren't stoked about their home doubling as a live fire range. To make matters worse, the Navy eventually forced those residents to completely relocate.
In the decades since, the abandoned tanks left behind have been steadily eaten away by the harsh, salt-laden winds of the sea. They're once solid steel, now flaking into rust and crumbling apart. In the summer of 1970, they launched a 7-month campaign, resistance marches, the population of this island, sit-ins, and human blockades that made it no longer worth it for the Navy. By 1979, the last bombs had fallen and the US military left. Over time, both locals and visiting tourists began using the hulks of tanks as impromptu art projects, layering them in bright, colorful graffiti that contrasts sharply with their battered frames.
These are 2 abandoned T-Series tanks in Iraq. Not an unusual sight there. There are thousands of pieces of crumpled up, rusted out hulls similar to it in the area. But these tell a dark story, because they are connected to a controversial operation that people still talk about to this day. The Highway of Death is the 6-lane stretch of Highway 80 that runs from Kuwait City to the border town of Safwan and on toward Basra. On the night of February 26, 1991, as Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, the US-led coalition air power pounced on the traffic-choked columns, and the result of this was one of the most memorable images of the entire war. The abandoned destroyed tanks became emblematic of how war had changed. Images of miles of burnt-out armor, trucks, and buses. Estimates of destroyed or abandoned vehicles on this stretch of highway vary anywhere between 1,200 all the way up to 2,000. With several hundred more on nearby Highway 8 inside of Iraq. For the American air crews, it was like shooting fish in a barrel or going on a turkey shoot or a duck hunt. Whatever it was brutal. It targeted the bottleneck north of Kuwait City. Wrecks jammed into an almost unbroken line, which was later nicknamed the Mile of Death. Coalition aircraft attacked from the front and the rear of the jam, essentially trapping everyone in the middle from going anywhere. And those air crews worked that target zone for hours. Contemporary accounts describe a 10-hour-long bombardment that turned the night sky orange and left hundreds dead. Casualty accounts from this operation vary wildly and are pretty hard to nail down, and a lot of that comes from the fact that a lot of those vehicles were abandoned before they were destroyed. The burned hulks included at least a dozen tanks and APCs. A ceasefire followed on 28 February, but not before Highway 80 and the parallel route to Basra had become shorthand for the coalition's dominance of the air-land battle. These images created a huge debate over proportionality and military necessity. The Iraqi units were retreating, but many were still armed. The argument goes that if they weren't destroyed, they could cross the border, reorganize, and would still then pose a threat to coalition forces. By the early 2000s, over a decade later, there were still burnt-out tank hulls and scorch marks all over that section of highway. And in a twist of fate in 2003, that same highway again carried American and British forces north during the opening phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Photographs and comments by soldiers confirmed that not everything was cleared up by then.
These abandoned pieces of equipment all over the world are fascinating to me for many reasons. You don't see these kind of things in military recruitment ads. Stand out as kind of like monuments. They tell their story without even speaking. Part history, part warning of war's destructive power.